And I'm happy to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Colette Despagne, who's a professor in Puebla in Mexico at the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla. And she's a living example of plurilingualism and pluriculturalism, being French, having studied in Canada, working now in Mexico, and I don't know which other languages that she has. She's an expert on plurilingualism, and also working in a context where there are several indigenous languages. So welcome to Colette, and thank you for accepting the invitation today. No, this you do, yeah. And you can have that and that. Is that okay? Yeah. And you can go either with the arrow. Okay. Shouldn't I put it bigger? Oh yes. Sorry. Yeah.
But no, it's not here.
Oh. Yeah, yeah. Only we do. Otherwise, it's in the presenter mode. Is it still okay? Yes? Okay, perfect. And then you can go on with the arrows.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and I feel honored to be here. I did my PhD in Canada, so it's a good way for me to reconnect with you, because it's a time I had a lot of very nice memories. Okay, I will take you in this talk to another place, which is Mexico, and it's what I kind of try to speak about is about plurilingualism in post-colonial contexts. So, and when we speak about plurilingualism and language education in these contexts, the discourse and topics automatically are linked with questions of power, identity, and agency. And this is why the title of this talk, Pluralistic Approaches in Mexico, Decolonizing Language Learning and Decolonizing Research. So in order to try to analyze and explain why it is important to decolonize language learning and decolonize research, I will focus on a research I did back in 2012 with this group of students. So this group of students, there are indigenous students, but also mestizo students. Mestizo is the mixed race population in Mexico. Some are bilingual, so they speak Nahuatl and Spanish, Totonaco and Spanish, and others are monolinguals. But what they all have in common is that they come from the poorest rural communities in the state of Puebla. The state of Puebla is more or less in the middle of Mexico. To give you an idea, it's about 2 hours from Mexico City. The capital, Puebla, is 2 hours from Mexico City. So they come from a very poor rural communities in the state of Puebla, and they all got a full scholarship for undergraduate studies in a private university in the city of Puebla. And they integrated a specific program called a Wager on the Future. So these students are representative of a wider national problem, which has to do with social and educational asymmetries. So if we have a look at some statistics, we can see that only 9.7% of indigenous people finish high school in Mexico, whereas 66.6% of mestizo students finish high school, and just 1% of indigenous students have access to university. So I worked in this private university for several years in the language department, and I was astonished at that time that these students from this group always came to see me and told me that English was the most difficult subject they had to learn. So at that time, I was quite astonished because I thought, okay, they already bilingual, most of them, so learning a third language should not be as difficult. However, I had a look at their TOEFL test results. They have to take the TOEFL test in order to finish their studies. They all have a 6-semester strategy-based instruction, and the pedagogical focus on that time was on language learning autonomy. So after the 6 terms, they had to take the TOEFL test. And in an average, WF students, so they are the participants in the study, had an average of 402 points, whereas the non-WF students had an average of 530 points. So this led me to ask myself, so what's happening? What are the contributing factors in this difference? And what should we do in order to influence their investment in EFL? So my objective today, therefore, will be to explore the socio-political dynamics, the historical forces and unequal power relationships which mediate language ideologies in the Mexican context by shedding light on processes by which these students, or in general minority students, learn new languages in post-colonial context. I also would like to advocate for pedagogical approaches to language learning and teaching, which take into account students' cultural heritage, languages, and localized knowledge. And in this talk, I will try to attempt to decolonize research by engaging the students not only in data collection, like we often mostly do, but also in data analysis. So in order to do so, I will talk about identity, power, and agency in language education and in post-colonial context specifically, and then I will focus on the Mexican case by giving a brief overview of the historical background and how languages represent as symbolic power. Then I will explain how I try to decolonize the methodology and will present the findings, and I will finish with some implications for language education in post-colonial contexts. So in order to understand the macro post-colonial context of Mexico, I focus on Latin American post-colonialism, which will allow me to understand the unequal power relationship between languages and cultures. I used applied and critical applied linguistic theories to understand the micro context, and then I meshed them together with the methodology. Okay, so as I said, the language department at that time was the pedagogical focus was on language learning autonomy. So from a general perspective, autonomy comes from the concept autonomy comes from the European Enlightenment period. And it was perceived as something universal and to have control over one's own actions. Henri Olek retook the concept in language learning, and he defined it as the ability to take charge of one's own learning. The Council of Europe, when the CFR was created, also based the pedagogical focus on language learning autonomy, which is the ability to learn and to develop social, cognitive, metacognitive, and social affective learning strategies. And in David Little's words, autonomy then is the learner's psychological relation to the process and content of learning. There are several approaches in language learning autonomy, but generally in Mexican universities, when they base their teaching on the CFR, they follow the mainstream approach, which is the psychological approach. So they perceive that autonomy is not something innate. Students have to learn to become autonomous learners. So it's an internal transformation of students. Autonomy from this perspective is to lead students to plan, to be able to plan their learning objectives and activities and to put them into practice. And the context is the one of the language classroom and the one of mediated learning, where teachers will assist learners to develop cognitive processes. So from my perspective, even though I truly think that from this perspective, students' background knowledge are taken into account, I think that there is no real reflection in the classroom on historical power and ideologies related to cultures and languages. And in post-colonial context, this is very important when we work with indigenous students. So the approach I'm favoring is more the socio-critical approach, where it is still an internal transformation of students. So to become autonomous, an autonomous student is an internal transformation, but this internal transformation leads to a social transformation. And autonomy then is perceived as the power of control over the context and processes of learning. And the context is the wider socio-historical context, a context where there are power relationships and where these power relationships influence social practices, discourses, and languages. So from this critical perspective, what we have at the core is culture, and specifically critical multiculturalism, which obviously accepts, recognizes diversity and difference, but which also recognizes that in this difference, there are inequalities. So what they focus on is to see how students position themselves in the language classroom, or how they are positioned, how they will be able to develop a resistance agency, and how that they may be able to reposition themselves differently. So identity is also perceived as multiple, not unique. And students, they lead students to create imagined communities that will allow them to invest in the language learning process. So autonomy is not perceived as a universal good anymore. They move more towards a kind of social autonomy, which is not an ability to be learned, but a position from which to engage with the world, where the meaning is constructed through questioning and awareness of the ideological world. That is the difference, the power difference between languages and cultures. So these approaches use pluralistic approaches where students' multi-competences, fonts of knowledge, or communicative repertoires are taken into account. So I believe if we focus on the CFR, that the companion volume with the concept of mediation takes this a little bit more into account. There was also a framework called, I don't know how you call it in English, FREPA, is it the same? It's the framework of reference for pluralistic approaches to languages and cultures, which was developed by a French group of researchers after the CFR. So the idea was to focus on linguistic and cultural inequalities. And in Latin America, there is a whole array of critical pedagogies where we can focus on and from which we can learn. So it's a very long tradition of critical pedagogies in Mexico, which began with the emancipation processes of the 19th century, with the literacy programs in the 20th century. In the 50s, there is a whole array of popular education whose aim was to fight against oppression and educational inequalities. And from a general perspective, the whole work of Paulo Freire created a lot of educational alternatives in Latin America that were used by social movements, Christian groups, and critical academia. When you work in Latin America, it's important to know also that language education is divided. So on one side, we have the whole body of research, which has to do with indigenous education and with bilingual intercultural education. That's how it's called today. And on the other side, we have research and teaching of the so-called international languages. But there's no communication between both groups of research. So that's why I'm advocating to create a more integrated vision of bi and plurilingual provision in Latin America, and to learn from what has already been done in indigenous education. So indigenous education began in the 20s, and it was bilingualism. However, it was more a clear bilingualism towards assimilation, towards the unique language, which is Spanish, and the unique identity, which is the mestizo identity. In the 70s, it changed a little bit. It was called bilingual bicultural education, and it recognized the right to maintain and to strengthen indigenous languages and cultures, but it was still a folklorist perspective and still assimilationist. In the 70s was the real beginning of the intercultural perspective in Latin America. And the concept of interculturality is very different in Latin America to how it is understood here in Canada or United States or Europe. So as far as I understand, in the West, interculturality is the acceptance of difference and diversity and the empowerment of minorities, but in the same hegemonic identity project of each nation state. On the other side, in Latin America, the aim is to change the idea of identity in the nation state. So the focus is on identity and language policies, to change language policies in each nation state, and it has a transformative vision. It aims to deconstruct socio-historical asymmetries and power relationships and to transform historically entrenched inequalities. So in bilingual intercultural education, there is an official body of bilingual intercultural education created by the state, but the critique says that it is still assimilationist. So it just exists for primary level, and in secondary level, they have to go to school in Spanish. So it has no real, it's not ongoing. So it's primary level, then secondary and high school, it's in Spanish. And then suddenly at the university level, they go back to bilingual intercultural education. But what happens in secondary and high school level? However, there are a lot of grassroots experiences which are very interesting and from which we can learn. There is a new body of research a few years ago, which is much more recent, which has to do with critical pedagogies and ELT, in English language learning. And their aim is to support teaching and the study of languages that promote social justice. So their main objectives is to question and unveil cultural and linguistic ideologies, to take a stance on critical pedagogy, and teaching has to be transformative. So the aim is to connect of these critical pedagogies, specifically in English, the global, which is represented by English, and to show that by validating students' fonts of knowledge or communicative repertoires, or how we want to call them, it is possible to increase their investment in EFL. So all these theories make sense in, in a post-colonial context like Mexico, where the discourse is created based on a colonial discourse, which led to racial and social hierarchies and to internal colonialism. Mexico was created as a nation state in 1821, and it was based on Spanish as a unique language and a mestizo identity as the unique identity. And all the linguistic policy therefore leads towards assimilation. When the nation state was created, or during the process of creation, there also, the most important is the doctrine of mestizaje. But this doctrine was also, or is still used to hide social practices of discrimination, and it institutionalized the colonial divide. So it's always indigenous people versus non-indigenous people. Even though in Mexico there's a huge cultural and linguistic diversity, there are 68 indigenous languages, divided in 364 linguistic variations and 11 linguistic families. And all the languages and 69 national languages are recognized in the Constitution since 2003. So it's all the indigenous languages and Spanish. The reality of the context is that it's a multiculturalism, but a neoliberal multiculturalism, which recognizes diversity and difference, but it's still perceived as a problem that has to be solved through cultural inclusion. Okay, so because of this context, because of these unequal power relationships, and because of the doctrine of mestizaje, this context created subaltern identities. So, and if we go back to the group of students with whom I work, they are representative of these subaltern identities because they are geographically, politically, and socially outside of the hegemonic structures of power. They live in very small communities, and when they were accepted to study in the private university, it was the first time they left their local community. So in this context, this context is fueled with colonial legacy. So we have to understand, in order to understand students' context, we have to understand the colonial legacies in their specific context. That is, how their specific context is shaped by the colonial past. And in order to do so, we need to critique Western hegemonic, the Western hegemonic discourse, and to reject the colonial divide, that is indigenous versus non-indigenous, minority versus non-minority students. We have to try to understand their history from their perspective and to challenge the principles of modernity and coloniality, which always come together. So modernity is understood as the hierarchical construction of power and knowledge production, which comes from the West. If you have been to Mexico, maybe you have seen that everything which comes from Europe, Canada, the United States is always perceived as being superior as what is in Mexico. So that's modernity. And modernity leads to coloniality. If we believe that knowledge from the West is more valuable, then indigenous knowledges, or from a general perspective, Latin American knowledge will be eliminated. And so it's important to see both modernity and how modernity leads to coloniality. And in these processes of globalization, Garcia Conclini speaks about processes of hybridization. So students the students in this study have multiple identity. They have their local identity from their local communities with their local languages. Then they come to the city of Puebla, which is an urban community represented by Spanish as a national language. And then they move into the EFL classroom, which is highly global, and they have not many references to this world. So with this process of hybridization, we will be able to see how students are able to negotiate in between these at least 3 identities which have unequal power relationships. And in this context, obviously, languages have highly symbolical powers. Spanish, even though it's not the only national language, is the de facto one. It's perceived as the only national language. It's the language of assimilation to the Mexican nation state. And if you want to be perceived as a Mexican in Mexico, you have to speak Spanish. So monolinguals in indigenous languages are not perceived as being Mexicans. Indigenous languages are still perceived as being dialects in post-colonial contexts. The idea of dialect is that it does not reach the level of a language. It's not considered as a legitimate language. And English is perceived as the main cultural capital, the main instrumental language that everybody wants to learn. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview. I put in this research culture, identity, and power relationships in the middle. I use concepts such as colonial legacies, modernity, and coloniality in order to explain the macro context. I use the theories about perception, language subjectivities, autonomous language learning, in order to understand how students invest or do not invest in the language classroom. And I also try to understand the learning approaches from students and from teachers and from the institution. So this leads me to see if students are able to develop a certain agency in order to be able to engage differently with the world, and if they will be able to invest in their language learning process. So because these post-colonial contexts are fueled with unequal power relationships, I believe that it's highly important to try to decolonize research practices. So we therefore, as Western scholars, have to recognize indigenous and minority people's belief system and knowledges, and we have to question our own hegemony. That is the hegemony of Western cultures by using critical theories. And this is what I tried to do in this research, which was a critical ethnographic case study. And as I will explain now, I tried to integrate students' voices not only in data collection, but also in the data analysis. So I created 2 groups of students, one for data collection. So we have 9 students in the data collection, and in the other group, 6 students. So it's a mixture of indigenous bilingual, indigenous monolingual, and mestizo students. And if you want to decolonize research practices, we also have to oppose discourses. So that's why I use multiple methods in order to oppose the dominant discourse versus the discourse of participants. So I try to capture the dominant discourse through the analysis of national and local policy documents and informal interviews with teachers and administrators in the university. And I captured the students' voices through semi-structured interviews. I did 3 interviews with each student. So they were interviews between 1 and 2 hours. And then I observed them in the EFL classroom twice. And I also did informal observation in the context during a year. So in this research, I believe that the most important topic was the data analysis itself. So I tried to do a localized knowledge creation, that is a mixture between my perceptions as a Western scholar and the perceptions and the analysis of students themselves. So I did a two-level analysis. First of all, I did a normal inductive analysis where I did in vivo coding, which I then meshed with the typologies in the theoretical framework. And this gave me a first analysis. So this first analysis, from this first analysis, I worked with the second group of students with whom we created an interpretive focus group. So I took the idea of the interpretive focus group from a research done in medicine from Dodson, Piatelli, and Schmalzbauer. It has nothing to do with linguistics, but I like the approach. And they used this kind of analysis with poor people in the United States. What I did with students was to ask them, so students of the second group, to ask them to critique and to reinterpret my Western interpretation or misinterpretations. And that's the way we were able to create a localized knowledge. So they were participants in the analysis of their own world. So what did we find? Okay, so here, that's what we find on the macro level analysis and micro level analysis. That is how they perceive themselves in the Mexican macro context and then in the micro context in the EFL classroom. So we clearly saw clear colonial legacies, because when I asked students what modernity represented for them, they all told me, without exception, it's synonym to the United States, to English, to technology, to innovation, and to a change that is imposed on them from the outside. So their change, again, is from the local community to the national urban world and to the global classroom in EFL. And this leads to a coloniality of power, because they perceived Anglophone knowledge superior over the Mexican one. And here we're going to see some excerpts. Elena, for example, said, to enter modernity, we have to speak English. English and modernity are the same, they represent the US. And this leads to coloniality, because Leticia said, when we want to study academic subjects, all the books are in English, and yes, the books refer to more technological stuff. Spanish books explain generally more basic stuff. The most up-to-date books are in English. And these colonial legacies have an impact on how languages are perceived. So indigenous languages in general are perceived as belonging to the past, to the Mexican past. In the nation state creation, in the mestizo identity, indigenous languages do not exist in reality. They belong to the past, which differentiates Mexicans to Spanish people. For indigenous people, it's their present, their past, obviously, their present, but it's also their identity. So they're highly identified with indigenous languages. Spanish is perceived as the national language, as the language like a bridge. Because of the different indigenous languages, they perceive that English serves as a bridge, so different indigenous people can communicate together. And for all of them, it's the language of assimilation towards the nation state. For monolinguals, Spanish monolinguals, it's their identity, obviously. And English is perceived as a goal, as a change. They want to learn English to be able to access to this global modernity. Students also refer to a two-level steps modernity for them. Going to the university and learning Spanish is the first modernity. It's like the national modernity. And then English, learning English for them was the access to the global modernity. So it's a two-level modernity. They also feel that English is imposed on a national level and at the university. And the IFG students also reminded me about the historical and socio-political aversion towards the US and English in the Mexican context. So let me show you some excerpts. Frida said, in Mexico, they are pretending to make English an official language now, and we have no choice but to speak it. So that is an example for the national imposition. And the local imposition at the university, Jorge speaks to it, he said, here at the university, we already know how to speak Spanish, and now they want us to speak English.
Yeah, they expect that.
Expect us,
okay. Sorry. Okay. And yes, Jorge's story was very interesting because he grew up in Nahuatl and he had to learn how to write and read in Spanish, a language he did not know. So that he felt it as the first imposition. And now studying in this private university where a lot of stuff is in English, he feels the second imposition like the same way as he felt Spanish being imposed on him. If we have a look at the micro context, at that time in 2012, there was a framework shift from the CFL to Actual. And Actual has a clear, from my perspective, a clear monolingual language teaching approach, which does not take language power relationships into account. And they also had an EFL teacher program at that time, which did not encourage teachers to promote students' diverse linguistic and cultural knowledges in the learning of English. Okay, so this context, the impact, how does this context impact on students? So they all feel discriminated against in the Mexican context and at the university because of the case-based society. And it surprised me that they also highly feel discriminated against in the English language classroom, because they said that their peers, those who did not belong to the WF program, used their English knowledge to show them that they already belong to this global modernity to which they still do not belong to. So this discrimination, okay, here we have other excerpts. Leticia said, it upsets me that there are still people who support inequality. They accuse us of being less intelligent. Additionally, they don't even say indigenous, but Indian. And Guillermo said they think they know, so he's speaking about his peers in the EFL classroom. They think they know everything, that they know a lot of English. They feel superior. They do not care about us just because of English, and they make you feel it very clearly. So how does this impact on their subjectivities in the EFL classroom? So we can see, and this is general in Mexico, that there's a still ongoing colonial divide. So it's always nosotros, we indigenous people versus the others, those who are not indigenous. And this colonial divide has an impact in the EFL classroom because they feel in fear because of, partly because of their competency level in English and because their background knowledge is very different. So they have different communicative repertoires, they have different multi-competences or different fonts of knowledge. And they feel fear to participate in the EFL classroom and also to lose their scholarship. So Jorge said, for example, talking about the colonial divide, the real problem is that the others know a lot, much more than we do, so he perceived them as superior. And Teresa also said, we were really behind all the others. So even though this context, in this context, they feel discriminated against, there were part of the students, not all of them, but who were able to make use of their agency by reclaiming the ownership of English and to invest in the EFL classroom. So if we go back to the concept of intercultural hybridization, Garcia Canclini says that it can be successful, this hybridization. It occurs, obviously, in all of us, but it can be positive or it can be negative. It can be successful or not. When it's not successful, it leads to assimilation because conflicts and power relationships are not resolved in students' multiple identities. So that's why they assimilate towards mestizaje and the unique language, which is Spanish. So this leads to cultural loss, obviously. Jorge said, some people seem to be ashamed. Yes, I think they feel shame of where they come from. Some people arrive at the university and suddenly they don't remember their communities anymore. They feel as if they had lived in Puebla forever, as if they do not come from rural communities. And Angel added, this cultural loss occurs because they want to be modern. And to become modern, Angel says, means a change in life. It means you have to leave your cultural tradition behind and to forget all this so you can have new generations. So that's the worst case scenario. There are also positive hybridizations that Garcia Canclini calls happy hybridization process. And this occurs when students are able to negotiate in between the unequal power relationships in their multiple identities, and when they are able to legitimize their local identities. Guillermo said, for example, I want to enter modernity, but without ever leaving my past. I never forget where I come from, my origins, and now I am adapting here. I'm doing this fusion. I will go back to my community just the way I left it. I don't forget. Marisol gives another example. You have to speak about your life in class. It's better if they know about your community and your tradition. This helps you to be proud of yourself. This is yours and nobody has the right to take it away from you. And Lourdes confirmed this idea in one IFG session, and she said, if your identity is strong, if our identity is strong, we will never lose our roots. So, students who enter this happy hybridization process are also those who challenge the status of English and of languages in general. So, and by challenging the status of languages and of English in this specific context, they reclaim the ownership of the language. So even though they believe that English is the norm to be learned to get access to the modern world, that the mastery of the language is the precondition to this global modernity, they negotiate the power of the language so they don't feel threatened. So in the excerpt, you will see that there a real negotiation occurs. Let me read it. So by challenging the status of the language, Leticia reclaims the ownership of English for Mexico. She said, I feel that English now is not a foreign language anymore. At the end, we hear English everywhere in Mexico, even in indigenous communities. It's becoming like a third language. I'm not the only one, neither the first one, nor the last one who has to learn it, right? And Guillermo reclaims the ownership for himself. He said, I would like to make English my own, something I could identify with, to see it as something normal, so not a powerful language, a normal language, a neutral language, and not as an obligation anymore. I would like to merge the English language with my own culture, because in the end, it's only a language, a form of expression, what's inside me that will never change. So as we can see, these students who challenge the status of the language also become agents of their own language learning process and are able to invest in the language. They will create local imagined communities by using the symbolic power of English as a source of learning investment. And we will see in the excerpts that they use and appropriate English to reposition themselves differently in the Mexican context and in the EFL classroom. So Leticia said, there is pressure, Angel, there is pressure to speak English if we want to be better. If we don't speak Nahuatl, nothing happens, but we need to speak English to be perceived as competent. If we speak English, people won't say anymore that we come from poor communities and that we don't have education. So they are trying to reposition themselves in the Mexican context as indigenous, competent and educated people. And in order to do so, they create their own pro-lingual and pro-cultural learning strategies by which they integrate their different communicative repertoires. So Angel is the one who created his own pro-lingual strategies. He said, with my nieces, we often pretend that we are cooking or that we get together for gossip. And then we say, in English, we say cat, in Nahuatl, nixton, and in Spanish, gato. We do the same with colors, animals, or any other things. In a certain way, it's easier for us. When we relate the three languages, it's easier to remember English like this. And the other student creates pluricultural strategies. Because English textbooks are too global, they're created in Anglophone countries. And this globality doesn't represent anything for them. So he's adapting the strategies to his own context. He said, that's Jorge again. He said, if what we are learning is not related to something I know, I kind of try to relate it. I look for a different strategy that will help me to understand. Last time, for example, the teacher asked us to write about a trip we made. I never traveled anywhere. The only place I really know, apart from Tlaola, that's his local community, is Puebla. So I talked about my experience when I first arrived to Puebla. That was my own personal trip. So what are the implications of these findings? Okay, the first one, I believe, it's the highly importance of understanding a student's context. Because we saw in this research that the struggles with EFL are indeed constructed socially and historically, On a macro level, English is associated with colonial legacies. And on a macro level, the university did not recognize the existence of inequalities, which leads to discrimination in the EFL classroom and to EFL subjectivities. So EFL learning success, or any international language, cannot be, or any language in general, cannot be exclusively be attributed to internal factors. Language learning autonomy cannot only focus on the psychological version of autonomy. The second important comment I want to make is the power of these happy hybridization processes. By being able to negotiate in between the unequal power relationships of their multiple identities, they are able to resist EFL subjectivities and to become autonomous language learners who really take the control of the process of their own learning. So they use the symbolic power of English to reposition themselves as no longer marginalized. They create their own pluralistic language learning strategies where they incorporate their multi-competences. So this confirms that the optimal language learning environment is the one where we can integrate a socio-critical layer of language learning autonomy to the pre-existing psychological perspective. The third point has to do with the need of developing critical reflexive learning opportunities in post-colonial contexts. Opportunities where in class with students, we critique and question the cultural and linguistic power relationships of students' macro and micro context. And this will favor in students this process of happy hybridization where they will be able to negotiate the unequal power relationships. So I would like to, I invite always in Mexico language teachers to focus on the tradition which already exists in critical pedagogies in Mexico in order to favor additive bilingualism, prolingualism. And to do so in the language classroom, we need to reflect on power and identity in the ideological world. We also need to reflect on our common assumptions. We need to allow teaching and learning to be transformative, to favor a dialogue between different knowledges, which in Latin America we call diálogo de saberes. We need to develop culturally pertinent curricula, which includes students' cultural heritages and languages, and we need to connect the global with the national and the local. And the last point I want to focus on is the methodology. So I hope I clearly explained why it is so important to decolonize research practices. However, it is very difficult to do so. It is difficult because the doctrine of mestizaje, which imposed this colonial divide, is still ongoing in Mexico. So there is always a colonial dichotomy between indigenous and not indigenous people, between European and not European, and so on. So we have to look for additional methods to decolonize research in these contexts. That's why I created this interpretive focus groups where I was able to integrate data and students in the analysis of their own world, where participants approved, contested, and reinterpreted my initial analysis, and that's how we were able to create a localized knowledge. So just to sum up, in post-colonial context, and I would speak only for Latin America, English is indeed associated with colonial legacies that impose unequal power relationships between students, cultures, and languages. discrimination on both levels has an impact on students' EFL learning process, and agency and happy hybridization process become fundamental in resisting these EFL subjectivities. So it's important in these contexts to decolonize language learning by using critical pedagogies, and it is important to decolonize language research by using participative research methodologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colette, for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to open the floor for questions and also for the remote participants in story.
Yes.
Did you look at comparable South American, other Central and South American nations where English and Spanish have the same level? Like Spanish is the official and English is de facto semi-official, and then there's indigenous languages. And see, say, Peru, Brazil, larger, comparable to the population. They have done.
Personally, I didn't do another study in another Latin American country. However, results may be similar in countries where the nation-state creation, the process of nation-state creation was similar, like in Colombia. There is research in Colombia done by, what's her name, De Mejia. She works on these English language learning in this context too. There's there are a lot of other research in Brazil, which is a country with a similar nation-state creation, which when similarity occur is when the nation-state creation is based on mestizaje, on this doctrine of mestizaje. The case of Argentina, for example, is very different because they are not based on mestizaje, and there was a lot of mainly immigration from other countries. So the relationship is very different. But in country, there's research in Colombia, there's research in Brazil with similar results, yes.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. I think it's very important for the field of language education, not only in North America, but also in Latin America as well. And I have a couple of comments, not necessarily a question, but in regards to how we challenge the colonial divide, I believe what you have done is very important. It's an attempt to sort of show a different way of doing things, especially in research. Also, I believe not only using critical pedagogies is enough, unless we actually start incorporating more indigenous ways of indigenous ways of knowing and learning into the classroom, especially, the work of Mario Lopez Gopar, who's been working in Mexico and incorporating indigenous language into the classroom, so to erase a little bit the divide between English and the other languages. I believe your research is on point. Also, I believe the idea of balancing the field, the playing field for the different knowledges out there, from social science, about the ecology of knowledges. So it's also important, and I also believe LINCDIRE, in a sense, it's a way to address these issues as opposed to high languages or hierarchy of languages. How we're gonna come up with both research and pedagogy that address those different languages out there. So just want to say thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the critical pedagogies I was referring to was to Mario Lopez Gopar. He's one of those who developed critical pedagogies in EFL.
Any comment from the colleagues who are listening remotely? Any comments or questions? Yes.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, didn't see.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. really, I'm from Peru, and just to answer briefly to your question, I would say that in Peru, the context is very similar. We went
Peru is another one.
historical process, and I don't know, there's so much recent research on that, but I think it's a good line of research. I have a question.
Yes.
Whether you found any differences between mestizo students and indigenous students?
In regard to what?
In regards to the different levels that you found when you were in that analysis, you find different levels of the way they perceive their discrimination in terms of the macro context and the micro context.
Can you reformulate it for? I don't think they have understood those.
The question is if there are differences between mestizo students and indigenous students in relation to the macro context and the micro context. There were obviously differences as far as the indigenous language is concerned, and because mestizo students just speak Spanish. But because they come from very poor local communities, the results were similar in the case of the fear of participating and not belonging to this global modernity. Discrimination in Mexico is not only based on race, it's also based on social incomes. So mestizo students who come from poor rural communities feel also discriminated against because they are poor. So there was an excerpt which said they won't perceive us as poor people. Now we're going to be competent and educated. So poverty and being indigenous goes together. But there are also many poor mestizo students who live in poor communities. So they feel discrimination too, differently, but they feel it too because of the social income and because they located in local subaltern communities. So they have no access to the rest. Yes.
Question. I liked when you distinguished this happy
hybridization,
hybridization versus the difficult. Because in examples also of this happy hybridization and even this, let's say, happy plurilingualism, there is also this idea of saying things in the different languages just to make sure that you know that they are always there. I was wondering if you have found anything that shows why some people get to this happy hybridization and some don't. Individual and social.
In this context, I think that all those who were able to critically address, who had a critical language awareness or cultural awareness, were also those who were able to negotiate in between their multiple identities and these unequal power relationships. That's why, as a recommendation at the end, I focus on critical reflexive opportunities in the language classroom to speak about these topics. Because most indigenous people who speak an indigenous language in the city, they won't use it because they're afraid to be discriminated against. So there were 2 students in this group, for example, who spoke the same variety of Totonaco, but they didn't know each other that they spoke it. So they never spoke together because they feel discriminated against. So it's like a taboo, maybe, that you have to put on the table and speak about it. And I think that by speaking about it and by reflecting on what people feel, they will be able more to negotiate in between these power relationships.
Yeah, please.
You said in the beginning that you were surprised that students said that English was the most difficult subject to learn. Were they able to explain why?
Yeah, their research, what it shows, it is that it's linked to the colonial legacies. It's linked because English is representative of a higher level modernity to which they don't have access, unless they are able to put all the languages and cultures on the table and to mediate between these unequal power relationships. What they feel with English is fear. They feel that it's perceived as something superior, and they feel fear to get there. So if we tell them, if we discuss with them in the language classroom that Totonaco or Nahuatl is as important as English, and that they don't have to hide to speak their languages, that we invite them to speak about their languages, their cultures in the classroom while speaking in English maybe, or any other language. This will help them to trust more in this identity. So it's the unequal power relationships which makes them fear in the classroom.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Sorry, just one comment and one request. So Shelina Adasia, I think she's in Ottawa. She says, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to say that I really enjoyed hearing you speak about localized knowledge creation. For example, students participating in the analysis of their own words, as this is something that she's looking to do in her own research study. And a request from Sylvia, she is in Europe somewhere, who asks if the PowerPoints of the presentations can be made available on the website under, and then I suggested perhaps under readings and presentations, the presentations could be made available. Yes. Oh, sorry, she's in Hamburg.
Sure. And
can I reply just to the second?
Yes, sure.
Technical. We are recording the sessions, so we will not only put the presentations, but the sessions as well.
Sorry, we can't hear.
We are recording the session.
The session is recorded, so yeah. She can.
You can watch
hear it. Yes.
Okay, fantastic.
I just would like to add that this research will be published in a book too at Routledge in this year of critical multiculturalism. So I think 2020 maybe, hopefully.
Great, thank you.
Great. So, well, thank you again.
Thank you.
And I think it was really appropriate to have a view from the other part of the continent, you know, the other part of after the Ecuador. And to see that we, in spite of the geographical difference, well, now from Mexico, but also from South America, it spanned beyond Mexico, to see that the problem is shared, it's not localized, unfortunately, is very spread, but that solutions are also share a lot in terms of being aware of this difference and encouraging the value of all the languages and the new position towards what does it mean learning a language.